All right, so our next session features Sandra Sedo of Cardiovascular Systems, Inc. She's going to be speaking on our next step, managing compliance. So Sandra is the Chief Compliance Officer at CSI. She's responsible for managing the company's ethics and compliance program, and that included implementing a corporate integrity agreement. Sandra has over 25 years of experience as a lawyer and compliance professional, including being a partner at Dorsey Whitney, LLP, and as an in-house attorney and deputy compliance officer at Medtronic. So with that, take it away, Sandra.
Thank you, Mary. Appreciate the opportunity. Today, I'm going to talk about what do you do once you've got that program built. Amanda went through and talked about the 7 elements. So the next step is, what do you need to do to make sure it's not just a paper program? So first slide, please. So as Amanda talked about, there are, known 7 elements of an effective compliance program. I'm not going to go through each of those elements in detail, but let's say you've got a program built. What do you do now? And that's what we're going to talk about today. Next slide. So this has been mentioned before. Compliance programs are never static. They must evolve. It's just a requirement. First off, the compliance landscape is always changing. Just as Mark and Dulcie talked about the new fraud guidance that came out, or fraud alert that came out in November on speakers programs, things like that happen all the time. It's your responsibility as heading up a compliance program is to make sure you keep up with those current cases and guidance. I find doing that, there's a couple of ways that I do it. One is I work with knowledgeable counsel, so folks that are really steeped in this and are following it probably more closely than I am. Also joining industry or compliance associations, MDMA, AvaMed in the medical device industry, our pharma for the pharma industry. Those are just examples. We get great information from those associations. There's also compliance associations like HCCA and SCCA, which are located here in Minneapolis. Those are more focused on compliance in general, compliance programs in general, but again, great resource if you're looking for information. Mark also mentioned things like Law 360. They give email updates every day. Those are a great resource as well. Even if you don't subscribe, you can get free emails. They give you a lot of information. For me, it's really, I look at them and I say, gosh, what's happening today? What's going on? And then if I want to delve into it more, I find other resources to help me figure it out. But again, it's a great way to know just what's happening out there. And also know that your compliance program has to evolve because your business is always going to change. You're going to have to continue to redesign your program to fit your business, whether it's new products that are being offered, whether it's new markets or geographies that you're going into, things will always change. And as a compliance professional, the goal is to always stay ahead of those changes. So get yourself invited to meetings so that you know what's happening and what's going to be happening in your business. The other thing that I like to do is I like to create allies in the business. Those are folks that I know are in some of those meetings that I might not be in, but it's just one of those things if you can check in with them every once in a while and just say, hey, what's happening in your world? Tell me about what's going on. What's new in marketing? What's new in sales? It's a great way to keep in touch with how the business is evolving. And it also is a way that you can kind of multiply yourself. If you create those allies in the business, folks that you can talk to on a regular basis and that you trust, then they can be your eyes and ears. They can come to you when they see issues or have other questions. And then the other thing that I think the compliance professionals learn is that getting good at designing processes is really important, because a lot of these processes, so for example, if you talk about speaker programs and picking speakers for speaker programs, get involved in designing the process for how speakers are selected so that you can then insert those compliance elements into that process so that you're creating a situation where you're kind of doing your work up front as opposed to trying to clean up messes on the back end. Next slide. I always say that the biggest thing that I can do as a compliance professional in an organization is creating that credibility around compliance. And there's a few ways that you can do that. One is that you really need to focus on creating an ethical culture. It's not just rules. It's not a paper program. You just can't put rules out there and processes out there and say, oh, it's going to work just fine. You want to make sure that you've got folks thinking about what is the right thing to do. So when I talk about ethical culture, I mean partnering with your HR group to make sure that there's trainings on ethics. Partner with your HR group to make sure that there's discussion about doing the right thing. Making sure your code of conduct is written in a way so that folks understand what are the do's and the don'ts. And it's not all about rules. I do training with monthly training with all of our new employees that come through the organization. And the only message I want them to walk away with from that training is that we can put all sorts of policies out there. We can have all sorts of rules that handle things, but we're never going to be able to cover every situation that arises in the day-to-day work environment. And that's where it becomes very important for each individual, each employee to understand that they have an obligation to fill in those ethical gaps with their good decision-making, with their good moral compass. And that's really what I'm talking about when I talk about creating an ethical culture. The other thing is you really need to focus on your risks. You've heard other folks talk about this, and as it was mentioned during my introduction, CSI did go through a CIA. We just finished it, 5 years. It's a long time, but I will tell you that any interaction I had with our OIG monitor, everything always came down to where are the risks in your business and what are you doing about those high risk areas. So an annual compliance risk assessment is a must-have. You must go through and assess your business and say, where are our greatest vulnerabilities? And then what you do after that risk assessment is you design plans around it for the key or emerging risks. So you figure out what your training plan is going to be around those risks. You train to the areas that are higher risk. You do more training with your sales force because they're probably your greatest risk. You do your monitoring associated with those risks. And then there's something that somebody once, wiser than me, once said to me about compliance is that focus on what the business pays and what the business says. So what does that mean? What the business pays is those interactions where we're paying a consultant, those interactions where we're paying for travel, those interactions where we're paying for a meal. Those are areas of focus that you need to look at very closely. When we talk about says, that is, what are we saying about our products? So what are our ad promo materials look like? What are our reps saying in the field when they're out? So those are the two kind of touchstones that I think about when I'm assessing risks. I'm looking at those interactions where we're paying somebody, or there's some kind of transfer of value, or that we're actually talking about our products. That's the way that I look at risk in our business. And then the other thing to build credibility is really making sure that you build relationships at all levels. You need to make sure that your board is bought in if you're able to have access to the board. You need to make sure that your executive management is bought in. You do that probably through your compliance committee. Here at CSI, we have quarterly meetings with our executive team where we do an hour-long meeting that talks about just compliance, and is one of those meetings that everybody attends, nobody's traveling, and we just sit down and talk about things. We talk about the state of the business, we talk about what's happening in the compliance enforcement environment, and frankly, our best discussions at those compliance committee meetings relate to some of the cases that you heard Mark and Dorsey talk about earlier today, because folks do like to understand what's going on, and they do like to understand what other companies are doing so that we can avoid those mistakes. The other thing I always want to say is that if I say I'm going to do something, if compliance says they're going to do it, then do it, and do it when you said you were going to do it. Make sure that you have that credibility built. Communicate your value proposition of compliance all the time. It's not something that people have as top of mind. It's something that they need to be reminded about. You heard about a lot of that in the prior presentations, why compliance is so important. You know, we want to be able to focus on our mission of serving our patients. We want to be able to promote our products effectively. We don't want to be dealing with investigations. It's just one of those things that, again, not top of mind. You just need to make sure that people understand what is the value of compliance so that they actually will think about compliance in situations where they need to. And, my frame of reference is always a yes, we'll figure it out mentality. Somebody talked about compliance as being the sales prevention department. That's exactly what you don't want. So many times I've been in conversations with folks, they'll come to me and say, I want to do X. And it's probably not something we want them to do. But then the question becomes, what are you trying to accomplish by doing X? What is it that the business is trying to do? What are you trying to move forward from a business perspective? And that usually opens up a broader conversation to say, oh, you want to do that? Okay, well, here's some other ways that you'll be able to do it. I find that is a great way to build credibility with folks if they know that you are not going to just have that knee-jerk reaction and say, no, you can't do that, and really try and work with them. The last thing is I try to create what I call ambassadors, compliance ambassadors at all levels. I talked about this before in terms of, getting those folks that are in marketing and sales, other folks that are, in other meetings that you can't be in. That's what I mean by ambassadors. Those are the folks that'll be potentially asking compliance questions, even if you're not in the room, because you'll have them trained to start thinking that way, to say, hey, what does this mean for the business from a compliance perspective? So again, if you can get those ambassadors, it's really, really helpful. Next slide. One thing I'm not necessarily personally very good at is creating structure, but compliance programs do need structure. A standard cadence is your friend. Plan out your reoccurring work on an annual calendar basis. Now, as a company who's just gone through a CIA, we had to do that because we had to do annual reports to the government for 5 years. We had to get certain things done by a certain time period in order to complete those annual reports. So it was pretty easy. But again, it's just a great practice to fall into and make sure that you're doing it. And design plans for everything. Make sure you've got an annual training plan. Make sure you've got an annual monitoring plan. Make sure you've got a risk assessment plan, as I talked about, and just plan things out and say potentially, okay, in my first Q1, I'm going to have my training, monitoring, risk assessment plans done, but I might execute my training plan over all 4 quarters. I might execute my monitoring plan over all 4 quarters. I might do my risk assessment in Q3. Just as I said, just plan it all out so that you know what you're going to do when. I also highly recommend creating an operations manual. And what I mean by that is putting down pen to paper in terms of what are the processes you follow, what are the cadence of events that you do, things like that. Unfortunately, we just had a person leave our organization, and I will tell you the operations manual was so helpful because a lot of times with compliance, people keep a lot of the things up in their head and they don't write it down on paper. So then when you have a transition, you aren't able to easily transfer that information. If you create that operations manual, if you put pen to paper, then you will have it. As I like to say, if I win the lottery tomorrow and decide to retire, I want this program to continue. I don't want everything to be, stuck up in my head. So that's number one, I think is a great thing. Also, as somebody once told me, if the government comes knocking on your door, if you don't have things documented, they're not going to believe that you've done it. So you need to document everything your program does. Part of that is the operations manual. Part of it is your annual plans, your training plans, monitoring plans. You really just need to make sure that you have that documentation in the event that you get a knock on the door. It's also really good to have that documentation so that you can kind of just review with your compliance committee and or your board. Here's all the things we did this year. Here were our objectives. Here's all the things we accomplished. It's a great PR move. Another thing you need to think about is your systems and IT and make them your friend. Automate anything you can do. For example, we have a process, a needs assessment process whenever we engage an HCP consultant. We have figured out a way to automate that so that it all used to, when I first started here 6 years ago, it all used to be paper and people would sign paper. Now we've got it automated, so it's all done in an automated system. It's not something that happens overnight, but just again, work toward that. Make sure that your compliance program data is stored centrally, accessible by those who need it. Again, this relates to making sure that you can have smooth transitions if you have people leave. It makes it so that if anybody is doing an investigation, they can find information that might be relevant, such as monitoring records or things like that. I would also say choose credible vendors. Just ask people who's got the best e-learning trainings for compliance, who's got the best contract management system, all of those things that you need. You'll be able to get those, get references, and then it makes your job a lot easier when you're trying to then select a particular venue. And then the other thing I like to do from a business perspective, we're a small company, so a lot of times systems are designed and created and bought by other departments in our organization. I like to talk to folks and say, hey, if our guys are ever going to be doing this system, here's some data that I'd like. Think about, will you come talk to me when you're building this system? So for example, we just implemented Salesforce.com for our sales team. It's going to be a treasure trove of information that I've wanted from our compliance program for a long time. And we have been intimately involved with figuring out what data we can get from that new Salesforce system. It's just an example of working across functions, make sure that folks know what you need from a compliance perspective. And I will tell you, people come back to you sometimes and said, hey, you told me about a year ago that you were looking for this kind of data. Well, finance is also doing something here. I think I can get you that data that way. I've been very successful in getting things done with other people's money in ways like that. Next slide. And this relates to the point I just made. Compliance programs are always lean. You're never going to have all the resources you want to run a compliance program. That's where you need to get creative with your budget, get creative with quote unquote your people. I like to say that I have part-time FTEs in a lot of different departments here at CSI, and it's true, I do. We also try here to push out to the business any work that we can. So I mentioned before, we've got a process for HCP engagement. That now is run by a medical education group because most of our HCP engagements come through our medical education group. Do what you can to push out processes. We, for example, here at CSI, do not do the sunshine reporting. That is done by the finance organization with our help and our oversight. They run our expense system, Concur, so they're the ones who are best able to gather all that data. Again, try and get creative, use those other FTEs and other departments when you can, because you know you're not going to have enough people in your compliance department. Next slide. So I just want to talk now, switch gears a little bit and talk about a couple of watchouts related to some of the 7 elements. These are things that I've learned over time. And it really, again, are things that I think about to make sure that we're not just running a paper compliance program, we're really running an effective compliance program. Policies. Don't use legalese in your policies. Use plain English. Make sure people can understand them. Make them readily available. If you have an intranet site, make sure they're available on the intranet site so people can search them. I also say, if you can, don't use just read and acknowledge for training on those policies. Make sure that there's FAQs. Make sure that there's other things that folks can just pick up and read and say, oh, that's what you mean by this policy, or this is what this policy is trying to accomplish. I'm big on trying to give people the big picture from a compliance perspective, as opposed to the minutia. And my goal is always to say to folks, here's the big picture, here's things, you be the issue spotter. And then when you have questions, here's the resources that you can go to get those questions answered. I find that to be very effective in my organization. For training, I think Amanda already touched on this, but get creative. Use things other than PowerPoints or e-learnings. Create a campaign to get your message across multiple times in different channels over a set period. So, and I'll tell you, this is not something that you're probably going to do the first year of your compliance program. This is going to be something you evolve to over time. But what we've been trying to do here is, especially with our sales organization, is create kind of a theme for a month or quarter and say, this is the topic we're going to talk about. We put out a newsletter that covers that topic. And on the front page of the newsletter, we've got information that is relevant from a policy perspective. Here's the things you need to know. And typically on the backside are kind of a Q&A. And what we try and do is we try and show scenarios of where people have gotten in trouble, in that particular area to try and show folks, here's some day-to-day things you need to think about or that you might run across, and here's ways that you can avoid it. So that's our goal. But we put out the newsletter, and then we supplement that with other emails. We supplement it with other trainings. We supplement it with other messaging. So for example, Sarah mentioned going to the national sales meeting. It might be something where we then supplement at the national sales meeting additional training on that particular topic. And I want to put a plug in for whatever you can do to get out into the business and meet people. I don't know about you guys, but my experience as a compliance professional is that when people see your name on the phone, when you're calling them, they're usually pretty scared. They're trying to figure out, why is the compliance officer calling me? I want to get to know people personally as much as I can, so that they don't have that fear, that they know that they can talk to me and they can relate to me and relate to anybody on my team. Again, going to the national sales meeting, sitting down and having a drink with somebody and just talking with them is a great way to make sure that you build that relationship. And that's really, really important. Getting back to training, the last thing is whatever you can do to tailor it to a job function, do it. People hate getting training if they say, I will never, ever need this information. So whatever you can do to tailor it, please do it, because you'll get more credibility from the organization, people in the organization, because when they see that training, they'll know it's important. And it's not just, oh, yeah, it's another policy, I got to train on this. Next slide. Communication channels. For me, this is, again, trying to figure out how to create that open door policy so that folks feel comfortable coming to you. And frankly, it doesn't have to be you. It can be your legal department. It can be your HR department. It can be other executives. The message I always try and get out to the organization is that if you need to ask questions, you can go to anybody. You don't have to come to the compliance officer. But also make sure that you publicize your hotline in many ways, many times. I find that's very effective, because then folks feel that there is an open door culture in your organization. They feel like they can raise issues if they know that matters that go to the hotline will be addressed. Monitoring and auditing. As I mentioned, whatever monitoring and auditing you do, tie it to your risk assessment. Only look at the areas that are really your highest risk areas. Don't focus on the mundane stuff. It's just a lot of make work. Just focus on your high risk areas. And then I always like to understand what we're trying to do. Then you look for data sources. A lot of people do it the opposite way and say, what data can I get? So therefore, what can I monitor? In my opinion, that's not being very effective. I think what you need to do is figure out what your overall plan is from your risk assessment. You need to figure out what areas you want to look at, and then you figure out where you can get those data sources. As I mentioned, sometimes that takes time. Sometimes you have to rely on other departments. For example, I'm relying on the sales organization to implement Salesforce to get a lot of the data that I wanted for the last 5 years. But it's finally happening, and it's gonna be great when I get it. And then again, the other reminder, as I mentioned before, focus on what we pay and what we say. Focus on those interactions where there's transfers of value, and focus on those interactions where there's transfers of information. Next slide. And then lastly, this is my last slide, responding to issues. It's really important that you have an overall picture of what's happening from a compliance perspective, to know if trends exist from your hotline calls, from your investigations, looking at other government enforcement actions. That's where you kind of synthesize all the information together. For those of you in the FDA world, it's sort of like a CAPA response. You figure out what the problem is, you figure out what the root cause is, and then you figure out what the solution should be. I always try to determine root cause of an issue. Sometimes that's hard, but to the extent that you can do it, it's really helpful, because then you can pinpoint what do you need to do to try and fix it so that issue doesn't happen again. As you've heard before, you need to be consistent in terms of discipline. Ask what we've done before in this situation, and make sure that you're consistent in terms of what your response is to any particular investigation or any particular issue. The other thing that's challenging about this is you really need to publicize what you can when you can do it. So that means if you've had an investigation, there's been disciplinary action, to the extent that you can publicize that in the rest of the organization, it's really helpful. for a couple of reasons. Number one, especially in my organization, there was a lot of fear when we started our CIA, and folks were very concerned that if they made one little misstep, for example, if they had one meal over the meal limit, they were going to get fired. We had to do a lot of education to make sure that folks understood that that wasn't the case, that it really was, we were looking at the facts and circumstances of each situation, and that one meal overage wasn't going to get you fired. So a good way to do that is to publicize those cases when you can. Sometimes I find that I have to have a lag in between the time period of when we do the investigation, when we close it, and when we publicize it. Wait 6 months, a year, so then folks don't necessarily say, oh yeah, that happened to John Smith. Oh, now I know why he got fired. So again, it's one of those things that it's kind of a tension point with your HR folks. They really don't want you to publicize things, but to the extent that you can and get it out in a generic way that you don't necessarily identify particular employees, is really, really helpful to make sure that, number one, folks understand what are big issues and issues that would cause true disciplinary action. And number two, it's also a learning exercise so that folks can avoid those issues. And then as, again, the last piece of it, it is really kind of a circle. You go through, you do your investigation, you figure out what the root cause is, and then you reassess what needs to change in your compliance program. What are we missing? Did we miss training in a particular area? Do we have to have a new policy or a change in a policy in an area? Do we need to do more monitoring in an area? So again, it's that loop, and you need to close that loop when you finish an investigation. Next slide. That is all I have today. I'm very happy to take any questions if any folks have any. But again, your goal here in managing a compliance program is to make sure you bring it to life in your organization, to make sure it's not a paper program, and make sure that you've got the rest of your organization bought in that compliance is important. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for that, Sandra.